and we're extremely fortunate to be able to partner with Slack for the past 6 months, to produce many group sessions. And so, if I may, Sid's session is something that I think all of you are also pretty excited about, as much as I am, alongside with Sid's co-worker the past couple of months as well. And so, for today's session, learn as much as you can, and hopefully you can share them online. Share your learnings as well. Hashtag Slack X ADPList, and yeah, and share it with the rest of the world. And this session will be recorded as well, so you can also watch the replay. Hopefully, folks at Slack like it enough. We can do more of this in the future. And with that said, today I have here with me Sid on this session to talk about designing for the real world, and mainly Sid will be covering on the practical side of design. How he has done things throughout the year. I mean throughout his career. And Sid will also be sharing some pro tips as well. I'm sure of that. And Sid will also be walking us through his own personal journey while also sharing his story as a designer. So currently, Sid is a principal product designer at Slack, which all of us probably use and know about it. And he's a product and design leader with over 12 years of experience in designing for mobile and web apps at scale. He has designed for over 100 million over users. His personal journey has been fueled by curiosity, self-learning, and being relentless towards his next goal. And over the past few years, he have coached and mentored over 100 of students, mid-level and senior designers, just like all of us here, and sharing unfiltered and actionable advice on leadership, visual design, job hunts, portfolio review, resume review, interview skills, negotiating salary, and more. So with that said, I would like to pass on my time to Sid to actually share a little bit more about himself, and he will take us away with his presentation. Sid, thanks for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Cool. Thank you so much, Felix and team. It's awesome to be out here and kind of share my journey and some learnings with all of you. Today's talk is, I would say, will get fairly technical, which is the side of design I love. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to introduce myself, walk you through my journey, and then get into those details. So hello, everyone. My name is Siddhant, and I'm a designer at Slack, as Felix mentioned. I've been at Slack for about 2 years. But my whole journey actually started back in India. I'm from India, from a city called Pune. It's pretty close to Bombay. Um, and I spent most of my life out there. I did my bachelor's in 3D animation. I worked in India for a little bit as an animator. I'll get into that for a sec. Um, I then moved to Vancouver to do my master's in digital media. I was there for about 7 years, and most recently moved to Toronto. These are all pictures that I've taken, and Toronto has been the coldest of them all. The summers are great, but the winters are very cold. Um, anyway, so the start of my journey was really focused on animation. The closest thing to design that I could find in my city at the time was 3D animation and visual effects. So some of you may have seen these characters, but I animated for Penguins of Madagascar, a few different scenes, including the opening one. I worked on Shrek TV, King Julian, and stuff. So a very different world from where I am at today. Um, I slowly transitioned into the VR industry for about a year because the the biggest thing I wanted to change about the work I was doing was I wanted to create something that lasts longer and something that we could iterate on over time. So I joined YouTube. Out there, I worked on YouTube VR. And then I joined Skype, where we were exploring some ideas of how communication can happen in a digital space. Soon after that, I transitioned into pure software product design. I was at Outlook Mobile at Microsoft for about 3 years, working on a number of different features. And since then, I've been at Slack for the past 2 years. I currently lead their iOS, Android, and iPad applications from a design standpoint. And I am excited to talk about how that happened and some of the tips I've learned through these years. Cool. So the way I approached design early on was probably like similar to many of your own personal journeys, given that I never was taught design. Everything was like self-learned to a given point. And we all started with the process of a double diamond. We've seen this plenty of times where you discover, you define, develop, deliver, you diverge and converge, and you keep going till you find the right answers. In design thinking as well as in design school, we learned like the 5 whys of like asking people like, why are we building this? What problems we are solving and all of those. We also like looked at user journeys, like how somebody would complete like something from one end of the spectrum to the other. How would we build empathy maps so that the products we build feel more human? But what ended up happening in a lot of this process, while very important and useful to get to a specific answer, I found that in my early years in design, my portfolio ended up looking like this. It was 80% research and learning and 20% on the visuals and the actual final output and the execution of the work I did. And over these years, like I've interviewed like interns, junior designers, senior designers, and beyond, and I still see some of this propagating through as I'm looking through their work or like even as I'm mentoring people. But the whole idea of like designing for the real world, as many of you are in this industry, it is a combination of everything you've learned previously. It's not skewed towards research, unless you're a researcher, of course. It's not skewed towards like just storytelling. It's a little bit of everything. And I think the idea of like solving the right problem like lives through every stage of the design process, whether it's ideation, visual design, or storytelling. So like when you're ideating, you can like make sure you're solving the right problems. You're learning along the way, you learn your trade and you go on to the next step, which is visual design. And then, you also tie in storytelling into it. And it's never a waterfall. You're always jumping between these 4 loops at any given time. But today we're going to dive into a topic that's dear to me, which is visual design. So we're going to talk about like typography, grids, colors, platform accessibility, and personality. So there's a lot of like technical details that I'd love to walk you through and share some of my learnings about it. So over these years, all of the design I've learned has been self-learned, but I was able to boil it down to like 6 different things that influence my design decisions. To me, like good visual design is basically an orchestrated rhythm of typography, grid systems, colors, and personality. And all of these can be fairly simplified into like fundamental things that all of you can incorporate into your designs on a day-to-day basis. The way I look at these 6 buckets is like they're individual buckets, but they also work with each other. So good typography leads to like good grids, vice versa. And like typography leads to like personality, and all of these like talk to each other in many ways. So the way I design, I have like 6 kind of subconscious steps in my mind. And the first one like always starts with picking a platform. So whenever I look at design work around, whether it's for interviews or otherwise, one of the steps that's crucial when I analyze these portfolios and stuff is like, what platform are they designing for? Because you have Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android Web, and you have many other platforms that are not mentioned out here. And each of them have their own set of guidelines and principles. So for example, Windows has Fluent guidelines. They have their own OS controls. They typically work on like a 4-point or an 8-point grid, and I'll get to some details of that in a sec. Mac OS has like human interface guidelines, and they have very specific ideas of like how searching should work, or like how their controls should be placed, and like how their grid should be structured, what text to use, and similarly for different platforms. For example, like if you look at Windows out here, there's certain elements that are like non-negotiable when you're designing stuff, like the status bar in Windows, where you have the minimize, expand, and close button. You have the system controls in Android, like you cannot remove these unless you fit in a specific category of apps. You have system controls in iOS. So you have your status bar on top. You have your header, depending on how you're designing the app. And then you have your home indicator at the bottom as like part of the latest OSs. And in a lot of designs that I see and I critique and I mentor, I see that many of these like system controls are missing. So when you're designing, it still feels like a personal project or a portfolio. But just by adding these little details in, it starts feeling very real and like something the developers can associate it with. Because whenever you're creating headers, like, how much space do you leave for the status bar? Like, that's something that's usually unspoken of, but super important in the design world. Similarly with web, they have their own challenges. Like while they're not governed by like specific systems, you have like hundreds of thousands of screen sizes on laptops, desktops. You have tablets, and the same website can be rendered on your phone. So as you're designing, you need to make sure that your grids and your typography scales to these different sizes. So like once you've picked a platform, the next thing I dive into is like picking a grid structure. And when I'm designing, like the grid structure is at the core of everything I'm doing. And I see two different types of grids as designers start putting things together. So one are like your structural grids, which make up the structure of the app. It's like the anatomy of the app, your status bars, headers, columns, rows, and stuff. And the other one is like spacing grids. You have like 4-point grids, 5-point grids, 8-point grids, and 16-point grids. And I'll give examples of what that means. So in a lot of designs that I see, people like tend to mix up the idea of like 4-point grids with like 5-point grids, or like, typically like spacing is not taught in conjunction with your structural grids. So I want to show examples of how I make that happen on a daily basis. So out here we have examples of structural grids. So let's say I'm designing a simple website. It's a marketing website that I'm working on, and I want to make sure it's scalable in some ways. So because people have like massive monitors, I can't have the content scale all the way. So I'll say, okay, my stuff is going to scale to a maximum of 1280 pixels. And in there, I'm going to have 4 columns, and I'm going to reserve some space for the header. And once I have this little bit of structure, I can start placing content in. So it's like my logos, my buttons, the taglines, the images and stuff. And as you start placing these elements together, because they're governed by a specific type of a grid, your designs by default start feeling very clean. So you don't have to worry about large amounts of spacing and like how different elements talk to each other if you just start at a simple point here. Similarly, like if your website is a little more complicated, where like maybe it's like Bing or Google, where like you need articles or like you need like a search box and like there's more content below, maybe you have like a Mason grid thing going on at the bottom where you have like some small thumbnails, some large thumbnails. So previously, early on in my career, I would just like resize them to like what I felt was good. But soon I realized that led to like a not a very like rhythmic design. So out here, this shows like an example of like gutters versus content and like how these can be placed in specific structures. Similarly, like this is an example from a personal project where I was practicing grids. I decided to like, go with an 8-column approach and only using the middle 6 columns for content. And certain content like spans across 2 columns, certain content spans across just 1 column. So this was very helpful to start putting together something that looks and feels clean. If you use Slack, you'll notice that we have a 1-column structure right now where everything is in a single list for various reasons. But basically, we have certain margins and then all the content flow is top down and it feels clean. If you look at Apple apps, Apple Books has like a 2-column approach where at the bottom you'll see like 2 different books, but they're spaced exactly in the right column. And as you scroll, they again come back into the 2-column space. So it feels very clean when you're using it. And different apps do it differently. We recently shipped the Slack iPad app, and here it is a little more of a complicated grid, but the structure is very simple, where we still have 3 columns. The first 2 columns are static sized. So like it's 80 pixels and 300 pixels, and the last one is dynamic. So whenever the iPad resizes, we make sure that the content on the left still feels great and the content on the right scales well. So that's how like you can start thinking about like grids and columns as you're designing products. Next thing I want to talk about is like spacing grids. So when people think about or like talk about spacing grids, it's typically like 4-point grids, 6-point grids, 8-point grids, and so on. But what does that actually mean? Basically means that when you are designing your margins and paddings and like space between text and elements, you're adhering to a multiple of a number. So out here, a 5-point grid is like 0 points, 5 points, 10 points, 15 points. Like that is what your margins will look like. Whereas it's different for an 8-point grid or a 16-point grid. 8-point grids will feel tighter than 16-point grids because the minimum you kind of can get to in a 16-point grid is like 8 pixels of space, which is pretty less. So depending on like how you want to approach design, you can pick one. So I wanted to give an example of what this means. Let's say I have a little card about Geeta Joshi out here, and like it's a little description of her. And I see this and I'm like, okay, I can see all the content, but it doesn't really work well structurally. Why? It's because like when I see the margins, there's different margins on different sides of the screen. Between elements, there's like 11 pixels here, 12 pixels here, 23 pixels at the bottom, 21 pixels on top. And when you like start analyzing details like this, your design doesn't feel cohesive, or it doesn't feel clean. So the way I typically approach problems like this is I adhere everything to an 8-point grid. So this is like my redesigned version of it without adding any bells and whistles. Out here, I followed like an 8-point grid. And if I go into the details, you'll see that the edges are 16 points and the spacing between content is 8 points. I also like reduce the size of the image so it fits well with the name and the subtitle. So there's small things you can do to like clean up your designs in a long way. And this is like what the before and after looks like. You can see like a world of a difference, but you can add your own personality to this, like add more space or less space and stuff. I kind of designed an entire screen to show like how structural grids and spacing grids work together. So let's assume this is like a small company that sells 12 plants and that's their name. And you just want to like buy a few plants and you have this app. You'll see that on the top, we have the headers, the status bar, we have a button at the bottom, but it accounts for the home indicator, as well as like these little boxes. So like I have one main piece and then I have everything else below that. And if I break this down into structural and spacing grids, you'll see that I've made space for the header, made space for the status bar. The top image is still a multiple of 8, which is like 160. The spacing between the image and the text is 16. The height of the button is like 44 as like a recommended structure from Apple. The space between the little subtitle and the card is 16 points, and so on. The height of the button is 64 points because it's easy to tap, and like you're on a mobile device, so you want something very tappy. That's how like you can merge structural grids and spacing grids. The third thing I do is picking a typegram. So this seems like very obvious to do, but there is a few challenges when we approach picking typegrams on different platforms. The simplest way to go about it is like pick one display type, pick one body type, and choose 5 sizes for them. A display type is your header. So it's kind of a more bold approach to typography, and the body type is like the more legible version of it. So typically, if I were to break this down further, you can see your display type can have a lot more character and personality, whereas your body type can be much simpler, so it accounts for reading as opposed to a branding moment. And when you combine these on the right-hand side into multiple different types, you see that body, small body, caption, and micro, they're all body types because they're meant for content. And subtitle and headlines are a little more, have a little more personality. So you can kind of make it your own. There's like different types of pairings you can do, whether it's like grotesque fonts or it is serif fonts or even like sans serif fonts, and you can combine the two as part of your work. And you can see on the right-hand side how it starts adding a lot more character. Now, the first thing I said, like when I opened this up of like how I approach visual design, was picking a platform. And the reason I started with that was because that influences your decisions on spacing as well as typography. So on the left, we have Android. Material has like very strong and good guidelines on what your typography scale should be. So when you're jumping between different apps, the one you've designed and other apps on your phone, it feels familiar, and you're not like resizing text every time you switch between different apps. Whereas Apple is like slightly larger for various reasons of how they approach typography. Whereas on web, if you're designing like a product, maybe it's a little more subtle. But if you're designing a marketing website, maybe it's a little more bold in terms of how you approach your typography. So you can always refer to these websites like Material Design, Human Interface Guidelines, Material, or even websites that help you design your own type ramp. So typescale.com is a good one, where you can look at a good type ramp all the way from like a body font. It goes up and down, and you can make it as bold as you like. So this is an example. Like I showed an example of like how the grid works together, but what happens when you add typography to it. So you can see like this is an analytics platform for every startup, and I just like throw in some copy to see how it feels. And it feels pretty nice. The type for the header and the body are different. But the personality of the app can completely change when you just change your typography. So like, choose that carefully. And like, there's existing available pairings available for you online. So you can always look at those instead of pairing your own. Like I still haven't understood how to like pair fonts well, because that in itself is an art. The fourth part of this puzzle is picking a color. So this seems simple enough, but there's a little bit of theory to it. The way I like simplifying this down is pick 5 grays and 2 colors. Like that's mainly all you need for a static design. Like when you're trying to convert your wireframes to a living, breathing mock, these are all the colors you need. You might need additional accents for a primary color or like secondary colors, but not keeping it down to like 5 or 7 will make it very easy for you to design screens so it doesn't look different from one screen to the other. So I pick 1 gray for my primary text, and it's typically black. Secondary text is a little grayer than black. Tertiary text is a little lighter. Borders are lighter than that, and backgrounds are the lightest. And then I have 2 colors, like 1 primary, 1 secondary. And the way it renders itself is out here, I have a primary color on the top left, and I have a secondary color on the top right. I use my primary color for like logos and brand accents, whereas secondary colors for buttons and success states. But at the bottom, I have a range of grays. And by having these in your color palette in Figma, you can say, all my primary text will always be gray 900. All my secondary text will always be gray 800. And because of the naming, you know that one is darker or lighter than the other. And if you need like additional states where your green is too dark for something, then make a simpler one, and like you can kind of reduce the saturation on that to come down to like secondary 200 or something along those lines. And these are like the basics of design systems that we all use from Material, Shopify, or many other products. The second last one is make accessible choices. So I think this is easier said than done. The way you can categorize most disabilities is into 4 categories, and like how you can approach it from a design point of view. There's disabilities around vision, around hearing, your motor skills, and cognitive skills. And the way design and products approach these from a visual design perspective is in a few ways. So for example, if you're accounting for like visual disabilities, you want to make sure that the app you're building is easy to use with screen readers. So like make sure you don't have a lot of organic elements that don't have a structure to go top to bottom or left to right, because then people who are using screen readers won't know how things are arranged on the screen. Color contrast is a common one. People use high contrast modes on the phone all the time. And you want to make sure that as you look at your gray ramp, if you're designing specifically for an accessibility app or like for a company that has a large number of users, you want to make sure that your grid ramp isn't just 5 colors, because then you need to expand it to have power states, interaction states, and so on. That leads to contrast ratios. Larger text is a common one. Like very often I press like Command plus on websites because the text is too small to read. And a lot of people increase the font size on their phones or even on their desktop devices. So there's different ways in which you approach different um, accessibility topics. There's ones for like auditory. So like if you're doing something with video, make sure there's like closed captioning or like there's something accounting for that. If you are working around like motor skills, then make sure your tap targets are large enough for people to touch, so they don't have to be very specific as to like how they can get out to that button. And cognitive accessibility can be improved by like better human language, giving feedback when you're typing, noise reduction in terms of how many things are happening on the screen and stuff. But I did want to give one example of this from a colors point of view. So we spoke about narrowing down to 5 or 6 grays. So when I use my primary text color, which is the color on the rightmost side, on the color on the leftmost side, which is my default background, it passes all accessibility checks. But the moment I place this text against other colors, it fails all of them. But when I'm in dark mode, I need to switch the two. So I can still use the gray ramp, but now my text is using the leftmost color, and my background is using the rightmost color. So yeah, by using the same gray ramp, you're avoiding creating more buckets of information to get your work done. So this is like a very small, quick example of like how you can design for light mode and dark mode. But the moment you have more grays, you can expand to a bigger spectrum. And the last thing is make it yours. So this is a tough one. Everything I've shown so far has been around like a system and like following grids and a structure and stuff. It has been like choosing typography, colors, and like choosing an operating system pattern. But the way you can look at personality is like it's like this little sprinkle of you around your project. So like what elements can you push and pull to make it yours? So in this example, you can imagine that blue is like all the personality you're like sprinkling in different parts of your process. If you want to push a typography, then you'll have like more character text. You'll have a higher difference in like the body font versus the title versus the headline and stuff. So the range of your fonts will be bigger. Maybe you'll have a difference in like the display type and the body type. And the same thing with grids. Like if I'm working on an enterprise application that has a lot of features, a lot of different things, I'm going to go a little more conservative on the grids, maybe add more columns so my information is more organized. But if I'm doing something more artistic, like a marketing website or like a design studio website, I can go bold and say, I'm just going to do 2 columns and I'm going to play around with this. Same with colors. Like right now I mentioned you pick 5 grays and like 2 palette colors. But if you want to go bold with your stuff, use more colors and sprinkle that personality that you want to bring to your app. And lastly, OS patterns. So this is like always a tricky, touchy subject in like medium and large size companies, which is how much of OS patterns do we want to follow in the apps we're building? We can't have our app look exactly like any other stock app on Apple or Android. Nor can we go completely all out and say that we're going to do our own thing. We don't care about OS guidelines, because then the users feel lost as to how things are working in their app. So push and pull these parameters based on what you think is working well. And it can look like this, where it's a lot more colored in a way as compared to something that's a little more constrained. So I'd shown you the plants, the 12 plants app that I designed. These are 3 different versions of it that pull on type, grids, colors, and personality. On the left, I'm using an 8-point grid. And that's how like I'm spacing things. My images are well sized, my buttons are large and stuff. But my backgrounds are pretty soft, and I'm focusing more on the content. In the second version, you can see that I played around with the rounded corners. So like the top left of each image like feels like a leaf. So there's a little bit of personality in that. Um, but I still keep the structure the same. I pushed on the colors. So maybe my brand, 12 Plants, comes out in my app. And it's easy for people to like um, associate these colors with my brand. And the rightmost side of it is a version of the app that says, I just want people to see everything I have. I don't care about brand or personality in a way. I just want to keep or like show as much information as I can so they know how big of a variety we have. So this pushes the idea of like mobile design and how much content you can fit. But all these three are different in their own ways when it comes to typography, grids, colors, and patterns. And that's all. So that's all I wanted to share. These are like 6 um, things I keep in mind when I design every day or like even when I'm critiquing people's designs. And as a reminder, like good visual design is a rhythm of typography, grid systems, colors, and personality. And all of these can be intermixed with each other to get the results you want. And you can pick any website on the internet, even Craigslist, and you can say, okay, these are the columns they have, these are the colors they have, these are the links and the personality that they've built. Or you can pick the most colorful app or website like Duolingo, where there's a lot of animations and stuff, but you still see a set of grids and a set of patterns that they are there on. Um, this may have like seemed like a lot to like somebody who's new to the industry, but it took me 10 years to like figure this out in a way. And like actually start practicing it in my designs because like understanding is one thing, but like doing is another. And my message to all of you is like, start small, start with any one of these and like slowly build on top of your designs. And lastly, keep it simple. Um, so that's me. My name is Siddhant. I'm going to share out this deck on my Twitter at some point. So feel free to follow me if you want to see the presentation or references again. That's all. I'm happy to take questions or hear any feedback you might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sid. So Maggie has sent a link to everyone, so all the audience here can actually submit their questions onto a Slido itself for Sid, and Sid will be going through those questions, and we will take a couple of minutes for the questions to come in. Yeah, so Sid, you can unshare your screen, and then we will share our screen for the Q&A. Thank you, Sid, for the presentation.
No worries. I don't promise I'll be able to answer all the questions, but I'll try.
We don't have any questions yet for now.
Okay,
So
cool.
it's either too technical and they might need some time, or you will get a flood of questions later on, right after this, right after this.
Okay, sounds good. If anybody wants to speak up or like just talk about things, happy to do that right now.
Yeah.
If not, we can always take things offline.
On the Pigeonhole app. All right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I just got notified that it's the Pigeonhole app.
I see.
Okay. All right. Oh, actually, we do have a lot of questions. Not sure why it linked me up to the Slido. Okay. Awesome. Sid, we can go ahead and begin the Q&A. So I'll be moderating this side of the chat. Yeah. So the first question is, when designing for Android and Apple, do you follow material or human interface guideline?
Yeah, I did touch upon that on my last point, which is how much personality you want to build into your app and how much you want to follow the OS patterns. So yes, I definitely look at what material or human interface guidelines have to offer. And then depending on the context, whether I'm designing for Slack or freelancing for a different project or it's just a personal project, I'll push and pull on certain parameters. So if I don't know, like if I'm interviewing for Apple at some point and I just like want to design something that feels like Apple, then I will follow the human interface guidelines to the T, and like, build something that feels familiar. But if I would like want to push the idea of mobile design, then maybe I'll stay away from it a little bit.
All right, we're going to mark that as answered. All right, next question by Katie. So, Katie asked, what are some little details you appreciate when looking at someone's designs and portfolio? Maybe to make it more interesting for Katie as well as everyone here, Sid. So maybe you can share that in the perspective of looking at a junior's design portfolio and also versus a senior design portfolio. You know, what are the details that you appreciate about these two segments of people's portfolio?
Yeah, for sure. So typically when we are interviewing, or I should say when I'm interviewing designers, previously like I've interviewed interns as well as junior designers. And the way I approach assessing portfolios for like junior or early designers is looking at the process and how they're thinking about things. So I know I mentioned like the 80-20 thing, where 80% of the time early on is spent on research and only 20% on visuals. But if I see a portfolio that has like a good 50-50 balance of the two, and like the designer has focused both on the visuals as well as um, the um, the research part of it, that's a big plus in the portfolio. And I found like a lot of early designers also do pretty well at storytelling and like sharing their ideas because they spend a lot of time on their process and building something together. Whereas senior and principal designers, when I'm interviewing folks, I typically look at um, a combination of research, uh, visual design, storytelling, as well as leadership. Because you cannot discount the idea of storytelling and leadership when you're working in a medium or a large company. A lot of what you're doing is like selling your designs or even like getting buy-in for certain larger projects that may lead to a change in how the business is approached. So when I'm looking at like senior or staff designers, I look at not just the research and the visual design, which are like a set of musts, but I also look at the second parts.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Gonna mark this. All right. Next question by Anonymous. Could we have the presentation slide be a great reference for us? That'd be really great. Yes, of course. You will get this. All right. Any chance you could share? Okay, I'm gonna mark this. How do you find the color values from 100 to 900? It's like a very technical question.
It's a great question. So there's a few ways. One is you can look at existing websites, like your material and HIC guidelines. They have their own set of colors. So if you look at material, they have a gray ramp of like 12 to 16 different colors. And it's basically like a pixelated version of your entire color set. But they do it in such a way where the designs are accessible. So like if you pick a combination of a foreground and a background, then by default, it will be accessible as long as they are 4 clicks apart. So you can always go to material to get those, or you can go to like human interface guidelines to also get the same thing. Now, if you want to kind of go on an adventure of like how to do this, you can, there's certain websites that allow you to draw a scale even on the colors spectrum. So you can say that I want my foreground to be this dark and I want my background to be this dark. And it'll generate all the colors in between and maybe push towards the darker or the lighter scale. So that's kind of how mathematically some of those are calculated. And you can do this not just for gray ramps, but also for primary, secondary, and tertiary colors.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sid. I gotta admit, it definitely sounds very technical even to me as well. So something to learn. All right. So next question from Daniel. Any reason we would want to avoid monochromatic scheme? One primary color to stand out plus a dark variant and white.
No, you can go for monochromatic. You can go for black and white if you want. Like, so even if it's like not a single kind of hue, you can go for a completely unsaturated color palette, and that's your style. Um, just an example, like I've been playing crosswords a lot recently before I sleep, and one of the apps I use, which is called Crosswords by Redstone, is all black and white. But it fits really well because like that is their theme and that's their language. So you do you. That's part of the personality of your designs.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Next, what are your views on using gradients with respect to accessibility concerns?
I'm assuming this means like gradients in the background or the foreground and elements and stuff. So um, WCAG, which is Web Accessibility Content Guidelines, has some information around this. Typically, we use gradients for like illustrations and stuff, or just as decorative items. So a piece of text may not have strong gradients because then it gets harder to read and harder to calculate if it's actually accessible. But decorative items around that users, screen readers, or even people who use zoomed in text versions, um, we can add as much flourish to those as needed because people can skip those and still understand the point of your app. So you can use them, just use them wisely in a way that it's accessible and it fits with your color scheme that you're building.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, so what are some apps you feel like have great design or that you take inspiration from?
Uh, there's a there's a few different apps. So my partner loves um, working on Duolingo. And I feel like Duolingo has done a very good job of pushing mobile design, but like having brand colors around um, while having a lot of personality to it. So Duolingo does a great job. On the productivity side, I think WhatsApp does a fantastic job because it's simple, it's non-complicated. There's some personality and backgrounds and maybe themes and stuff, but it doesn't interfere with the work you're doing. Um, on a more complicated surface, maybe the Stripe UI for their internal systems is pretty good. Um, yeah, those are some things that come to mind, but there's so many apps on the phone that look and feel so good today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sid. All right, so we will be answering our last question due to time, but feel free to send Sid any question after this as well, or you can send it here. We will definitely bring it to Sid after this session. Okay, so all right, so the final question, I will take it maybe from this one. Yeah, that best the highest vote. So, been looking at a screen from Apple's Health app. It seems to follow it point as well, even not consistently. Doesn't seem like a question, by the way. So I will skip this.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, this is an interesting one. So, how do you choose your typography? How to how to know if the one is a right fit?
It's very hard. It's like I said early on, I don't feel comfortable even like building my own typegrams and like, choosing my own fonts and stuff right now. Like it's an art in itself. You can be as subjective as you want when picking your display type or body fonts. But I typically work in the productivity space. So apps like Outlook, Slack, YouTube, or even Skype and stuff, where we had a defined typegram that was easy for the eyes to see and for content to be read. So there we go a lot more conservative. So if when I was working at Microsoft, we picked like Sego UI as like a company-wide font that we were working on. When I worked at Google, we used Roboto. At Slack, we used Lato and a combination of Lato and Larset. Um, and then if I'm working on Apple apps that can also borrow from Apple's own human interface guidelines, which is typically a combination of SF Pro display and SF Pro text, but you can also have like the rounded or the New York versions of it. So there's a lot of options even out there. And over time, like it starts feeling right, but I feel like somebody else would be better suited to give a talk specifically on choosing fonts, not me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sid. Cool. With that said, we have come towards the end of today's session. Sid, really appreciate you for being here, and thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this. And just a final shout out is that if you share your learnings in public, this week with the session with Sid, feel free to tag ADPList and Sid personally directly, and we'll be featuring some of the learnings actually on next week's newsletter to summarize up the Slack and ADPList exclusive sessions throughout the past 6 months. So Sid, I just want to thank you personally for being here today, and for every audience here, you'll receive the presentation and the recording as well by the end of the week, which is on Friday. So thank you all so much for being a part of this, and I hope to see you at the next one, next ADPList session. See you all. Thanks, Sid.
Thank you all.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.